Let's go back in time. Do you remember that America was discovered by Christopher Columbus? And this was in the late 1400s, almost 1500. And Mr. Columbus also discovered South America. So on Columbus Day, which is in October, both South America and North America celebrate because Columbus discovered both. Remember, Columbus lived over here in Italy, but he explored for the country of Spain. And because of that Spanish influence, when he discovered South America, which is right here, is kind of where he first landed, which is called Venezuela. When he sailed to here, he brought Spanish influence to this country and up through Mexico and clear up into what we call North America. It would be Texas and Arizona, California, almost clear up almost to the Idaho, Washington, actually to the Oregon border right there. It was all owned by Spain. And the Spanish people, the people there all spoke Spanish. The Spanish influence was great because of Mr. Columbus. And so these people, the Spanish people here that lived in Mexico, brought over from Spain, they brought some cattle. And these were cattle with very long horns, very, very long. And they also brought some horses. Now, up until that point in time, there were no horses, there were no cattle in any of the Americas. But because of the Spanish people, they brought these cattle from they call it the Iberian Peninsula over here. They brought them from here over to Mexico. So now there are cattle everywhere. And the Spanish people didn't believe that keeping cattle in pens or corrals or fenced land was the right thing to do. So they let their cattle roam. So you can imagine that in just a short amount of time, a few years, there were millions and millions of wild cattle roaming absolutely everywhere, and wild horses as well. And so the vaqueros, which is a funny word, it's a Spanish word, it actually means cowboy. And look how it's spelled. It's pronounced with a B, but it's actually spelled with a V. But it just is a fancy word, vaqueros, which means a Spanish cowboy. So the Spanish cowboys set up ranches and all over this area that they owned, clear up into the United States, and they set up these ranches with wild horses and wild cattle. And it was not an easy job because you have so many taming a wild horse is not a piece of cake. Taming a wild horse is very, very hard. That's what it is. But these vaqueros, they would rope a horse or get a horse and tame it and get on this back. And you can imagine if you're a horse, you don't want anybody on your back. You just like to be running free and wild. So they would get these horses, they would tame horses, and they would get gigantic cattle ranches, set up ranches by herding their cattle and by getting the cattle into their corrals. And the white men, not the Spanish so much, but the people that were from back east that were making their way in wagon trains, those people found out that they could have these cattle and get very rich because cattle, you could sell cows for a lot of money. And so they would move into the West. And that was one reason they traveled in the wagon trains to come to the West from the East so that they could get wealthy, so they could set up these big ranches just like the vaqueros had done. And of course, in all of that, the Indian population got the horses as well. The Indians found that if you had a horse, it was a lot better than just traveling on your feet. Because a horse can move, a horse can carry things, a horse can move at a great speed. And so that's how many of the Indians got their horses is just because they were wild horses, not necessarily because they stole from the white man, but the horses were wild and they were free for anyone to get. As the white man traveled to the west, the white man they had a different thought. The Vaqueros would keep their cattle that they owned. They would put it in they put the cattle in a corral or a place that was at least fenced. Well, of course, the Indians didn't believe in fences. And the white man, when they gathered their cattle, they would also put them in fences. And then they went to another step, and that was the step of branding. That had not really been thought of before, either by Indians or by the Spanish. And the white men would create a brand, and they would brand their cows. And just when they were little calves, they'd find the calves, and they would brand them right on their hip in a brand that was put in a fire and heated up till it was sizzling hot. And then they put it into the little cow or little calf, and then they would know if the calf got out or the cows got out, they would know exactly who they belonged to. And I saw some of your brands the other day that you had created, and I made the comment that many of your cows would be very happy to be owned by you. You had super duper brands, but the brands were usually simple, like a broken arrow, or an initial that looked like some kind of a picture. They were simple so that it was quick brand into a cow. And consequently, there were very many people from the east that became ranchers and had tamed all of these wild horses and wild cows. And of course, later on, as time goes by, it turns out that these people, they had these large groups of cattle or herds of cattle, but they had to get them to market. Because, yes, if you live out in the middle of nowhere, you can't sell your cattle very well. So they had to take them to where there was a city where they could sell the cattle, and those were cattle drives. And that's where the cowboy came in, the American cowboy. And the American cowboy would herd up these cattle, or take these group of cattle from one place, usually from an outlying area, like a little small village, to a bigger place. And then, of course, later on, as time goes by, the railroads come in. And the railroad, then they could take the cattle to the railroads, and the railroads could take the cattle to bigger cities. The cowboys' world was a different world. It was a world of a little bit lonely because they were always traveling. The cowboy would usually work for somebody or hire out for somebody, and they were told to take the cattle from here to maybe St. Louis, which was a big city in those days. And they would take the cattle, and the cowboy's life was all about keeping care of these cattle because that's how they were going to get paid. And at nighttime, the cowboys would sit around a fire where they would eat, and they would sing because whenever you sing, it's kind of a happy sound. It's a happy mode, or they would play harmonica. Or maybe a fiddle even, but it was a happy, songs are peaceful. Usually when you're upset, you don't sing. When you're upset, you don't play your harmonica. And so it was a soothing sound to the cattle and, to the cowboys themselves. And they would sit around the fire at night, and the cattle would be just grazing on the grass there. And they would try to keep the cattle very calm. Unfortunately, there were some things that could rile up a cow. It could be the war cry of an Indian. It could be a coyote or a wolf. It could be thunder and lightning. And then the cows would become agitated, and their eyes would become big, and their ears would stand up, and they would start to snort and start to paw the ground because, they were scared. And So the cowboys were always trying to calm the cows down, because every once in a while the cows would get so agitated that they would begin to run, and that was called a stampede. And the cows would go absolutely everywhere. And then it took the cowboys a long time to try to calm the cows down, try to get around them so that they could could corral them again and get them back into the quiet herd. So a cow stampede was not a good thing. Cows are known for that, and also buffalo are known for that. And when we talk about our buffalo unit coming up with the Indians, I'll tell you some stories about how the Indians used that stampeding to their advantage. And poor Buffalo was not good, because he ended up dead. But the Indians were pretty smart in how they figured out that a stampeded buffalo was vulnerable. They could easily be killed. So the cowboy, when he dressed, he had to have just the right kind of clothes. He dressed with a hat because they were out in bad weather, good weather, hot weather, cold weather. So he wore a big hat with it. Usually it had a high crown, just for ventilation purposes. He had a wide brim to keep the rain off of him. He wore chaps, which are kind of like leggings a little bit. They're like, except they're made out of hide of some kind. And he put that over his pants, and that would kind of keep some of his legs protected from horns of the cows or from brush or whatever, brambles out there. It would also keep him warm if it was a cold place. He always had a lariat. He always had a lasso, a rope that he could grab the horns of one of these cows and get him back to where he needed to be. And so he dressed the part. They slept out. The cowboys slept out in the air. He didn't have a bunkhouse, so to speak. They slept out in the open, and probably the cattle drive probably would take maybe a month to get from one place to the next. It kind of depended, but the cowboys were well prepared, and it was a whole different life to live this life of a cowboy. The Vaqueros later on, of course, the Spanish people lost America, and the Vaqueros just moved into the Mexico area, not into the United States area. And the Vaqueros still were raising their cattle and still building their big haciendas, is the fancy word. The Spanish word is kind of like big house. And it was like a big farm. And so the Vaqueros were actually moved to Mexico. And that's where they lived, and that's where they were happy. In our next session about the cowboys, I'll tell you a little bit about how life was on the trail in the wagon train area, and some of the wagon train life, and then maybe we'll transfer a little bit to some of the a little bit later about the gold rushes, or about the boom towns that were set up, or about the outlaws in the West. So that's our next study. Hope you enjoyed it, and enjoy reading your book. Okay, this is for your history. Bye.